Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Malloy, and today's lecture corresponds to 18.1 and 18.2 of your textbook, as well as includes additional information. But the page numbers you can refer to in your textbook are 389 to 392 and 393 to 397. All right, well, we've already learned that geography can greatly affect how people live and view themselves in the world. Japan is certainly no exception to this. Japan is an archipelago, which means it's a chain of islands located in East Asia, 100 miles off the Asian mainland. It's located near the Korean peninsula and is surrounded by the Korean Strait and the Sea of Japan. The archipelago is made up of 4 larger islands and over 3,000 smaller ones. The 4 main islands include Kyushu, Shikoku, Hokkaido, and Honshu, which is the largest of the 4 and where most Japanese people live. Japan has been isolated from its Asian neighbors as a result of it being an island nation. This relative isolation has allowed it to selectively borrow culture from its neighbors, most notably China. The result of this isolation and their lack of invasion have all contributed to Japan developing a very unique culture over time. Japan sits along the volcanic ring of fire in the Pacific, experiencing earthquakes and volcanic eruptions over time. Its geographic setting, coupled with intense forces of nature, has resulted in the Japanese development of a culture that reflects these elements in the natural world. In terms of size, Japan is slightly larger than the state of California. However, it boasts a population of almost 128 million. With less than half the population of the U.S. living primarily on an island that is just larger than California, helps perhaps give you perspective on Japan's population density. Japan is one of the most densely populated nations in the world, and although it's ranked 39th in the world in terms of population density, the figure is grossly misleading. See, almost 85% of the land in Japan is mountainous and uninhabitable. Most people have to live and farm on about 15% of its land. Factor that in, and Japanese cities suddenly become the most densely populated in the world. In fact, 50% of Japan's population lives on about 2% of its land. Wow! Well, Japan's population is actually in decline, believe it or not. Japan enjoys a fairly mild climate, with a long growing season. Its winters are generally milder than those found on the east coast of the U.S. The Japanese have had to adapt to their environment over time by using terrace farming to create more land for food production. Japan's main crop is rice, which they adopted from China. Japan's effective use of agricultural technology has allowed it to produce over 75% of the food it needs. The remaining 25% is imported. This is pretty amazing if you look at how large a population it has, as well as the availability of farmable and inhabitable land. It's also pretty amazing that only 8% of people in Japan are farmers. One of the major sources of protein for the Japanese is fish. Naturally, this is due to its access or proximity to the sea. And in terms of mineral resources, well, Japan has very few. This lack of natural resources has forced Japan to look elsewhere for these throughout history. Today, Japan is heavily dependent on foreign nations for its mineral resources like coal, copper, oil, and iron. Much of Japan's economy, therefore, is based on trade. The people of Japan are homogeneous. Remember, homogeneous is a word that means the same. We already learned about the homogeneity of the Korean people. Japan's geographic isolation from other nations has helped this homogeneity to continue and has contributed to a cultural sense of Japanese versus foreigner view of the world. There are a few ethnic minorities in Japan, including the Ainu and Burakumin people. The Ainu were the earliest inhabitants of northern Japan, who historically were excluded from Japanese society. This cultural exclusion persists today. The Burakumin people were the descendants of leather tanners and butchers from Japan's feudal era. Most Japanese people have animistic beliefs called Shinto, as well as Buddhist beliefs that influence their culture. Buddhists typically reject the taking of an animal's life, so therefore the Burakumin have been outcasts for this reason. This discrimination, unfortunately, still persists in some parts of Japan, even today. In terms of culture, well, Japan's culture is a unique blend of Chinese, world, and as well as Japanese influences. The Japanese place their origins in early clans or families. Some of these smaller clans merged to create larger clans. And one of the largest of these was the Tenno clan, who went on to become Japan's sole ruling dynasty. Korea served as a bridge between China and Japan. We've already learned that. Missionaries brought Buddhism and the Chinese script language to Japan. The Japanese culturally borrowed from the Chinese between 550 AD to 850 AD. The Japanese also sent its royal family members to China in order to study. The resulting cultural diffusion from China far supersedes language. Although the Japanese initially borrowed many ideas from China, over time they gradually kept the things that they liked and rejected what they no longer were interested in, which helped create a very unique Japanese culture. This selective borrowing from other cultures will continue throughout history. For instance, an example of something that the Japanese initially borrowed and then rejected from China includes the Chinese civil service system. Confucian beliefs certainly interested the Japanese. However, they believed that people inherit their position in society. Additionally, the Japanese never fully embraced the idea of mandate of heaven in the same way that the Chinese dynasties did. This is a possible explanation for the lack of changing dynasties in Japan. The Tenno clan was Japan's only real dynasty. Throughout history, Japan's capital has moved back and forth between several cities, including Kyoto in the south and Tokyo and Kamakura in the north. The capital was moved to Heian, which is near modern-day Kyoto, by the emperor in 794. It was here that a Japanese system of writing emerged. Although Japan has incorporated thousands of Chinese characters into its written language, Japanese words are primarily written with the kana script. Kana are written symbols that represent vowel and consonant syllables. They have hiragana, representing Japanese words, as well as katakana, which represent foreign words and sounds. Both the hiragana and katakana alphabets sound the same for the most part, but are written differently. Why is this significant? Well, if you ever go to Japan and learn both alphabets, you can immediately figure out foreign words versus Japanese words. It's really pretty cool. All right, well, let's talk now about powerful families. Ever hear about knights in shining armor in Europe? Maybe you remember learning as a sixth grader about the Middle Ages in Europe and how people in Western Europe often lived on manors, with life revolving around farming and serving their noble lords in society. Well, this system in Europe was called feudalism, and you'll learn more about it as 10th graders. So why am I talking about feudalism in a lecture on Japan? Well, guess what? They had a feudal system in Japan as well. Feudalism is defined as a political and economic system based on complex relationships in society that involve, usually, a king or an emperor. It includes people who have noble titles and land granted to them by the king. In exchange for the noble title and land, these nobles watch out for other people, and they have their own group of fighters who look out for the common people below them. The common people receive protection from the fighters in exchange for loyalty or service to the nobles. Hey, plus they get a place to live and farm. It's a mutually beneficial relationship for all involved. Still don't get it? Okay, well, think of your mom and dad as the king and queen of your house. They give you a bedroom, food, and clothing, and they pretty much take care of you. They might even give you a smartphone if you're lucky. In exchange for this protection and material goods by mom and dad, you show them respect and follow their rules. They might even give you chores to do around the house. You might not like the chores, but you do it because otherwise you wouldn't have a place to live, a smartphone, food, or clothing. See, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. Well, plus you all love one another, I guess. Anyway, in any event, if you don't have a clear-cut government in society, feudalism can be a great way to have stability. Well, in Japan, there were large families, like dynasties, that controlled the country. There was a single emperor in the capital who was more of a godlike figurehead who had very little power. Instead, these ruling families controlled parts of Japan. See, Mrs. Malloy is already misspeaking. These families divided up their lands into smaller estates ruled by local rulers or strongmen. Eventually, the Fujiwara family emerged as the dominant family in Japan. This family ruled for over 200 years. This will lead to a system of feudalism in Japan by the 1100s. Various noble families began fighting for control of the nation, led by strong warriors called samurai. Feudalism was established to stabilize Japan. In 1192, Minamoto Yoritomo was one of the strongest military leaders in Japan. The emperor gave him the title of shogun, or chief general of the army. Under Minamoto, feudalism became widespread. The social hierarchy under feudalism in Japan was as follows. The emperor was at the top of the social pyramid, followed by the most powerful warrior called the shogun. The shogun controlled all of the people below him, as well as the land people lived on. The shogun was also in charge of the army, made up of samurai soldiers. Below the samurai were lower-ranking military servants and peasants. Samurai often battled one another, and sometimes the shogun himself, to gain prestige or power and land, would also fight. But it was not a centralized or well-organized system until the 1500s. So how did they become one single organized system? Well, here's how they achieved unity. A famous general who helped Japan unite was a man named Toyotomi Hideyoshi. I probably mispronounced this, so let's try again. Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Got that? He managed to take over Japan and all of the samurai, putting them under his control. He even invaded Korea. His successor, or the person who came after him, was Tokugawa Ieyasu, who became the next leader, or shogun. He established an empire called the Tokugawa Shogunate, which lasted from 1600 to 1868. Under the Tokugawa Shogunate, Japan had a centralized system of feudalism. This centralized system of feudalism was very similar to the earlier feudal system. However, the most powerful samurai soldiers became known as, at this point, the daimyo. These daimyo were required to live every other year at Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. This was one way the shogun was able to control the nobility or aristocracy in Japan. Did I mention they were required to leave their wives and children at Edo as hostages as well? Yeah, what better way to promote loyalty, right? Well, centralized rule under the Tokugawa Shogunate resulted in a flourishing of culture. There was a golden age in Japan of art, music, and literature. Edo, or Tokyo, became a huge city. Complex roads and highways were built, there was an increase of trade within the nation, and instead of a barter system for trade, they began using a money economy or currency-based trading system. They set up banks, and they had an organized government bureaucracy. Bureaucracy simply means a system of government where you have government officials who take care of all the paperwork, the ones who collect taxes, etc. If you have a bureaucracy in a nation, it means that you have some semblance of organization or government. However, a bureaucracy doesn't necessarily equate to efficiency. Remember that. Well, the Tokugawa Shogunate also resulted in more educational opportunities. Under the Tokugawa Shogunate of feudalism, Japan was becoming a nation. All right, well, let's talk about this isolated nation to end today. One of the reasons the Tokugawa Shogunate was able to flourish and have a golden age was because of its relative isolation. We've already learned that many things can isolate a country. Sometimes nations choose not to have contact with others, like we saw in China. Remember the whole Middle Kingdom idea? Well, other factors that can lead to isolation include geography. Japan's location as an island nation naturally isolated it from other places throughout history. By the late 1500s, Europeans had grown increasingly interested in Japan, including the Dutch, Spanish, and English. Remember how I told you about the age of exploration during the period of Old Imperialism? Old Imperialism was based on the European concept of God, gold, and glory. Well, Europeans soon tried to introduce Christianity to Japan via missionaries. The Japanese shogun was feeling threatened by this attempt at conversion, and he abruptly stopped trading. The Japanese shogun feared that conversion would lead to conquering, and he was probably right. Christians were persecuted in Japan thereafter, along with missionaries. In 1639, foreigners were kicked out of Japan completely and forbidden to return. Japan soon entered a period of isolation from 1639 until the mid-1800s under the Tokugawa Shogunate. The Japanese did continue to trade with Korea and China on a very limited basis, and they did also allow 2 ships a year from the Dutch. This isolation will end in the late 1800s, and then we're going to see things really heat up in Japan. All right, thanks for listening.